Three, two, one. All right, Bigfoot Society. We've got the privilege of talking to, old friend Matt Pruitt. Had him on the podcast before. How's it going tonight, Matt?
Very good. Thanks for having me back. Had a blast the first time.
Dude, it was a good time. Yeah, listeners, if you haven't heard the first Matt Pruitt episode, you want to go back and listen to that, especially if you're fans of his of the podcast Bigfoot and Beyond. You know, Matt is the producer there, so there's a few questions over on that episode. So you definitely want to hit that. But let's talk about, you know, if listeners don't know who Matt is, I consider personally Matt to be one of the current great. Bear with me. I know it. Current great minds in Bigfoot research. Just being honest, like seriously, and a very humble individual. I've had the pleasure of talking to him in person at CryptidCon in Kentucky last year. Just very, very cool. He has over 20 years, I believe, of Bigfoot research. Um, and he has been just involved with so many things. Is there anything else that we should be throwing in there, Matt, to make sure the listeners know what they are getting into tonight?
No, I mean, it's very generous of you to say, by the way. So I'll try to earn that and live up to that. But no, I've been doing it. Yeah, it's been about, I started interviewing witnesses and gathering local information in 2002 and purchasing books and reading everything I could get my hands on and finding documentaries, you know, VHS back in those days, and then DVDs and things like that. So really that's about when it started. And then it's just grown from there, from where I grew up in Northeast Georgia. You know, I've told the story a number of times, so I won't belabor the point here, but I had an experience when I was 17 back in 1999, back in the 1900s. But I didn't really reconcile that with Sasquatch related information until about 2001, 2002. And then 2002 started looking for information and trying to get to the bottom of it. And here we are all these years later and still trying to get to the bottom of it, you know, many states and many years later, and worn a lot of hats with a lot of different Sasquatch related projects in between, and try to continue to do so.
It's incredible. And, you know, so listeners, I would say you probably have spent hundreds of hours out in the field. I mean, let's just talk about BFRO expeditions alone. I want to say at least 20 you have listed on your website all over the US, which is
Certainly
phenomenal.
Yeah, I started attending those. The first one I went to was in the Uaris in May of 2007. And that was the first time I'd met Matt Moneymaker and a number of other people. I started meeting local Southeastern BFRO investigators in 2006, and then was invited to that expedition. And so I attended a number around the country. And then when Matt started having BFRO investigators become expedition organizers, I did that for a number of years, from 2008 to 2013, you know, in the Southeast, and then the Pacific Northwest, and then around like the U.S. interior highlands, like Oklahoma, Arkansas, and places in between. And so, but I've always been really interested in being in the field. I mean, I think a good researcher should be equal parts sort of armchair research and field research, from the sort of like propositional, you know, to the participatory, as they say. So, and it's just great fun. And so I really love being in the field. I'm out as much as I can be. I can't tell you how many hundreds of days and nights I've spent, and have not seen a Sasquatch yet. Had some interesting experiences, but no really concrete visual yet. But yeah, one of the more interesting things from those years of being in the BFRO was getting to go around the country and meet so many people. And I met a lot of my best friends through that process too. You know, a lot of the people that I either met on other people's expeditions or that signed up for mine. Some of those, like, I'm still in contact with on a near daily basis and have been close friends with for over a decade. So really fun, rewarding experiences.
You definitely have a lot of connections with researchers for sure. I, you know, just had a gentleman on, I believe his name was Jeff Carpenter, and he had great words to say about you. I believe he said that you were kind of the one that got him into all of this. So
Yeah, Jeff is a sweetheart and a very funny person. He's in Western North Carolina, very close to where I grew up in North Georgia, not terribly far away. And so I forget how we started communicating. I was living in a different state at that time. I might have still been living in Washington State when he first emailed me, and then we finally met. He came on an expedition that I led, and then we've spent a whole lot of time together. And Yeah, I'll have to go listen to that episode. I didn't realize you'd had him on yet, so that's pretty cool. He's a sweetheart of a guy and very funny, great out in the field. But man, he always makes me smile and makes me laugh. He's got a good heart.
It's funny, and yeah, listeners, you want to listen to that episode if you haven't yet. Story of how he saw Bigfoot while he was listening to, I believe, AC/DC. So pretty cool story. But has there been a time when you've been out in the field researching Bigfoot where, sometimes I ask this question, where things just got a little bit too intense, maybe too quickly for what you were expecting?
I guess it really just depends. Intense encounters with something unknown, and then I've
Mm.
had some really intense encounters with humans. So
Oh,
I've had some intense encounters out there, just depending on the sort of creature. Luckily I haven't had too many frightening animal encounters. I've had loads and loads of black bear encounters, but none of those were, bluff charges or anything like that. Although we did have a fairly close call last year with a black bear that was charging. It was a female that was charging away a male, and when the male ran off, she turned and looked right at us, and I thought, we're next. We better just start moving away. But um, I mean, my first experience was very much of that vein, but we didn't know what we were dealing with, and I guess to some degree, I still don't, because we didn't see the things. But I mean, it was very intimidating. It was at night. Very thick vegetation. It was summertime in Northeast Georgia, and again, that was in 1999. But loud branches breaking, and then the sound of them being torn off the trees and then
oh,
hit against the trees. And so it's just strange to us because we couldn't really reconcile it with like bears or deer or some known animal, and they didn't seem to be people. And that, all culminated in, we did abandon our camp. We ran back to the vehicles and drove back to my mom's house and came back for our tents and coolers the next day. But then once I started going out in the field, like intentionally trying to elicit encounters or approaches or responses, there's a few that come to mind. Maybe not as intense for me because I was so obsessed with trying to like make contact, and especially to have a sighting. I do think that would be, it's a much needed thing for me at this point, because I've tried so hard for so long. And so I always feel like, you know, I, I, I might be like 99.9% certain that they exist, or 99 point, an infinite number of nines, but I think seeing one would make it 100% for sure. There was one particular time in, must have been 2006. And I have to say too, that a few of these encounters, they share something in common, which is dumb luck, because so many sightings and encounters are just they're serendipitous,
yeah.
and for the vast majority of witnesses, it just happened. It wasn't something intentional. Now, people have had sightings in the act of intentionally pursuing Sasquatches, but those are more rare. Like if you look at most sightings, they're just serendipitous, random, right place, right time. And so I was living in the Atlanta area, but still doing field research mostly in North Georgia. And I'd driven up to visit friends and family. And some friends of ours, I had a friend who would accompany me in the field quite often, and two other friends that were totally skeptical, like, oh, there's no such thing. And but I can't believe you waste your time on this. And these two were not particularly, like, they didn't camp, they didn't hike, they weren't really outdoors people. They were a couple of grades younger than us in school, although by 2006 we were out of school. But they were mostly like glued to the TV and video games and things like that. And so I just thought, okay, well, we'll just put them in the car. I'll take him out in the heart of darkness. They'll get the crap scared out of them just from being in the woods in the dark, and it'll be great fun. And so I had a headlamp that I borrowed from someone and a baseball bat to make knocks with. I was like, all right, come on. I'll kind of show you what we do. And we drove up sort of near the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River. It's where we
Mm.
filmed a lot of the night stuff during that premiere episode of Finding Bigfoot years later. And we went out there and parked the vehicle and walked up to a little sort of, it's not really an overlook, but it kind of sort of is there, because the terrain drops down and there's a creek down below, and then another feeder creek down the other side, and then essentially a big hill and a slope across this Forest Service road. And so I just thought it was the very first stop of the night. And again, there was no plans to even go out. It was just like, oh, these guys are going to be skeptical. Let's take them out and see if they get spooked by the darkness. First stop, we park. I'm like, all right, we're going to get out. We're going to walk up very quietly. Don't make any noise, you know. And we walk up to this point, and there's this large tree by the road. You know Micah Hanks?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I just took Micah to this spot
Okay.
summer before last to show him all this.
Mm.
Had this baseball bat in the dark, didn't even turn on the headlamp, you know, knocked this tree. And by the time I like crossed my arms with the bat in hand, from the creek bottom came this big bellowing moan howl, you know, the classic, ooh. And as that was going on, a second one moan howled from this slope, and their sounds overlapped. And it was just absolutely mind blowing because we had just somehow stumbled into getting between two somethings that made a howling response to a knock. It wasn't like a knock for a knock, or it wasn't like a howl or something like that. And I was just flabbergasted, you know, because I'd been spending all this time for the last few years with really not much of anything happening ever. And now this was happening. And then we could hear this sort of like heavy tromping, like marching.
Ooh.
And then it got dead quiet. And we're just standing there in the dark, frozen. And one of the guys is like, what happened? Are they gone? What was that? And I was like, what do you think that was? Like, that's, I told you, like, this is why we're here.
Yeah. Why are we here?
And he's like, why is it so quiet? And I was like, I don't think they left. I think they can see us. Like, as if they, you know, Bill, is that you? Kind of a thing. And then they come together, and then they see there's 4 humans just standing in this road in the dark. And then there was a big loud knock from the Down Creek side. Bam. And the other 2 guys started to get very scared and wanted to leave. And I was like, well, we can't leave. We can't leave. We need to go back to the vehicle if you're feeling scared, but we can't leave. But we will. Would that be okay? They're like, yeah. So we go back to the vehicle, get in the vehicle, roll down the windows, and we're just sitting there listening, you know, and it's just pitch black darkness. And then heard the classic sound, something coming through the foliage and the leaves, and thud. And then I turn on the daytime running lights on this vehicle, and there's this, you know, decent sized rock in the road with the Forest Service dust sort of off the Forest Service road coming up around it. It's like, okay, I think that was just thrown up here. But still, like, we're not seeing anything, you know, it's not like they're screaming and thrashing vegetation. There's still just these little things happening. And after a while, it got really quiet and nothing happened. And I thought, okay, now they're gone. It's over. Because, you know, when you're sitting there in the dark for 5 minutes, it feels like 20 minutes, you know,
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing happening. You're listening. And so we started to drive away and thought we heard like a whoop-like sound down creek side, but it's hard to tell. Like, I had the vehicle on and we're moving, you know. So as soon as we heard that, I was like, did you hear that? And my friend in the passenger seat said, yeah, I heard that. So I put it in park, killed it, you know, turned it off. It was like listening. I said, make that sound back at it. So my buddy leaned out the window and whooped, and we listened for a few minutes and nothing happened. I was like, okay, we probably didn't even hear something, like maybe it's just really over now. And we cranked the car and the lights turned on. And from the uphill side was this huge, gnarly, brutal, very high pitched scream. I couldn't even emulate it, you know, but brief in duration, like but just very loud, very close. And I distinctly remember the feeling. It felt like my whole face just turned white hot, like you put it over a campfire. Just all the nerve endings, just, you know, it's just terrified, you know, but excited. And the person behind me, the friend that was sitting behind me, started punching the headrest of my seat and saying, go, 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 go. And I was like, shut up. And I turned the car off, and I'm like, if we shut up, be quiet. Like, if we listen, we might hear it again. And he started crying, and he said, I will never forget the sound of this. He said, I don't ever want to hear that sound again in my whole life. And I was like, okay, we'll go. And so I turned on the lights, and I could see up the slope there was this tree with sort of an odd curvature in it. And I was like, okay, that's a very noticeable looking tree. It was somewhere in that vicinity. I can come back here tomorrow, go to that tree, and then start working up the mountain, see if there's any tracks or something like that. And he wouldn't go back with me the next day. He was like, I'm not going back there. I'm not going back there at all. And then in subsequent conversations, because he was a family friend, at one point, his mother had said to me, she was like, that really wasn't funny what you did to him. And I was like, I did not do anything. And she was like, well, no, he was terrified. He was absolutely terrified. And they owned a lot of property in North Georgia. And he had told me years later, he's like, "Oh, I don't even camp on my own property after that." And then
Wow.
his father told me in 2008, he was like, he told me about that night and he seemed pretty rattled. And I was like, "Oh, he was, like we all were." So that was probably the most intense thing. But there's two other sort of encounters that I've had, or experiences, let's say, over the years. Another one in 2008 in North Georgia, and one in 2010 in on the east side of the Cascades in Washington. Same thing, just
Hmm.
random, like, oh, let's go check this place out. Didn't plan to do it. Just, oh, let's go see what's back here. And something happened. Like we
Hmm.
stumbled into right place, right time. Just there's no proxy for luck. When you're dealing with an animal with a very large home range that's very mobile in it, it could be anywhere within that range. Even if you knew exactly where the boundaries of its range were, you're still going to rely on luck to some degree to be in the same exact time and place as it within that range. And so you get out there enough and sometimes it happens.
Ooh, that's wild. And when you took Mike out there, anything happened or
No, we
non-eventful?
went out there for a few days and nights, and I took him, and Jeff came as well. Jeff
Oh
that
yeah.
does Sasquatch tracks with
Yeah, yeah.
with him, and it was beautiful. And Jeff Carpenter was there too. So to tell you a funny
Yeah.
story, Jeff Carpenter had just bought this new thermal imager, and I took those guys on a night hike, and we went really far out up this. There's a road that's almost always gated. It's nearly permanently gated, but occasionally they'll open it during certain hunting seasons. And there are some wildlife planting fields back there that they might cut and replant every few years. So it's a great place. We see a lot of deer and other animals hanging out back there. But some of them are, 3 miles back beyond this gate. So I was like, oh, that'd be good. Let's park at this gate and go walk back here. And Jeff's got his thermal imager, and we'll see if there's wildlife around. And we'd gone out there and listened and weren't seeing much, and went further and further back to this smaller field. And I didn't have the thermal unit, Jeff did. And so I was walking ahead, and he's like, "Oh, hey, there's a deer laying down in that field." And I was looking in this field. It was fairly moonlit. And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I can kind of see the shape of something." And he's like, "Yeah, that deer's just laying there. Doesn't seem to be too concerned with you." And I was like, "Oh, well, I can kind of see what I think. Let me get closer." And I get closer and closer and closer. And he's like, "Dude, you're standing right in front of it. It's bedded down." And I couldn't see it. And so I was like, "Come, give me that thermal, man." And so he brings it over, and I look, and it's a giant wild hog. I'm
Oh.
like 20 feet, 15, 20 feet from it, something like that. I'm like, I think it must be full, because it really was not concerned at all. And so finally, like, I shined a big bright light at it, and it just got up and slowly sauntered. It was not in a hurry. Like, it
Oh
would
wow.
maybe had just gorged itself or something and was very lethargic. But I was like, "Jeff, man, you almost had me." Well, now Jeff didn't make me do it, but I was
Mm.
like, "That was a hog, man. That wasn't a deer. I almost walked right up on that thing." So that was quite the adventure. That was the only wildlife we saw that whole weekend, pretty much.
Man, crazy story, dude. Oh, I love it. Man, and it's those crazy sound experiences. It's like you never have a sound recorder on you because you're just, it's just off the cuff. But
Oh yeah,
man,
well, again, that was 2006, and so I wasn't in the
oh yeah.
BFRO. The only other I'd only at that point met like one other Sasquatch researcher
Wow.
who was in basically like middle Georgia or north middle Georgia, essentially. So south of Atlanta.
Mm.
And so we didn't get together as frequently because we were pretty far apart in terms of, he lived several hours away from North Georgia. And so field research for me was me either by myself or convincing my friends to go on a camping trip while I did this thing. And they would just sort of be there, because they weren't really, a couple of friends got interested in it, but for the most part, they were like, "Oh yeah, we'll go camping and hike around and look around." But it was really just me sort of on my own. But then my one friend, who I'm still close friends with to this day, who was there, he became, much more convinced after that night when
Oh yeah.
hearing those moaning
Oof.
howls and all that stuff.
That's wild, dude. Oh man, thank you for sharing. That was some cool stuff. Of course, as listeners might guess, uh I have brought Matt on to discuss his book, The Phenomenal Sasquatch, which was an incredible segue. I know listeners were all about that. This book is really good, Matt. Like, it's super. I wasn't expecting it to be extremely hard hitting, but like You do not pull any punches in this book, and you did a
Thank you
really good
so much.
job. So fantastic work.
I appreciate that very, very much. And thank you for reading it. It means the world that you would give it
It's
a
good
chance
stuff.
and support it and give it a read. So thank you very much.
Oh yeah, definitely one that you want to have like on your bookshelf. There's maybe some in the Kindle, maybe both. Maybe you could get Kindle too, but definitely on the bookshelf. Um, I was really curious when I was reading it. Was there a motivation, you know, um, behind writing this book, or like what pushed you? Like, okay, I need to get my take on what's going on out into the world through this book.
Yeah, well, I've been very fortunate enough over the years to have been asked to, I started doing interviews for internet radio and then podcasts and terrestrial radio media, things like that. I started speaking publicly about the subject in 2007. And then, so not only through that, but, personal correspondence and outreach, and then being on BFRO expeditions or leading BFRO expeditions, you just communicate with so many people. And I was very fortunate enough to hear a lot of people say, "Oh, you should write a book. You should write a book." But I sort of really lived in that world of dialogue. I just find it's more productive. Writing can be really tedious, and when you're speaking to someone, you have the ability to make various analogies based on who your audience is. So if you're trying to explain a concept to a room full of biologists, let's say, you can use certain terms or examples or analogies. And if I'm speaking to a room full of my musician friends, I've got to use some like different terminology and different analogies to try to make these things connect, or seemingly disparate ideas connect. And so writing can be challenging because it's like, no, you have to say it one way for all audiences forever. That's it. You don't get to
Mm.
say, well, hey, no, look at it from this perspective, or okay, how about this? So it was always an interesting proposition, but I just really loved being in these kind of situations where we can talk dynamically, or even, it's speaking in public to audiences. It's still kind of a conversation because you're watching people's reaction and body language, and trying to, feed off the crowd, and like, okay, okay, maybe I lost someone. Let me explain that a little bit more for that
Right.
person. But it was to the point where I thought, well, I've been very much a supporter, or like support personnel, or even like when I worked on Finding Bigfoot, it was like fixer, and I really love doing that stuff. Some of my favorite experiences in bands was where I was like the side person, playing with a favorite band of mine, but then it came time like, well, what would I want to make as my sort of statement, devoid of any other projects or anything like that. And so I thought, well, I would like to write a book that would hopefully aim high, not just another collection of stories, or, because it's not about me. It's not my story by any stretch. And so I thought, well, when I got into the subject, it took me a while to accumulate so many books that I really learned a lot from, or that I consider to be like essential or required. And then some of those hadn't even been written yet, because then later there was Meldrum's book, and then later Bennernagel's second book, Discovery of the Sasquatch. And so when people would say like, well, what should I read? It's like, well, here, at least these 5, and then maybe these 10, and you'll get a pretty good education. And I thought, well, maybe I could write the sort of book that, like, if you only ever read one, this would give you a really thorough education and a comprehensive overview of the entirety of the phenomenon, let's say, the subject itself. And then if you wanted to do deeper dives into certain elements, if you wanted to learn more about inferred foot morphology or anatomy, read Krantz, read Meldrum. If you want to read a collection of eyewitness testimonies, go read John Green. So you could have this as a jumping off point, but at least it would be, what I was trying to do is like the single most comprehensive work that, like, I wish that I had when I first started, but also expand and develop it beyond. I didn't want it to be like a rehash of things that had been said before, but to push the conversation and explore concepts that hadn't really been explored before, make connections that I hadn't seen or heard other people make before. And so it would hopefully appeal to people who are devoted students of the subject, but also if someone was brand new, they would get a bottom up education of like, we're going to build the whole foundation all the way up to the top floor thus far, and you'll have a good understanding from this single work. So I don't know if I achieved it, but that's what I was trying to do, at least,
No, I would say you definitely did. Oh man, it's really, really well put together. Because I remember I was like halfway through, and I was like, man, this is really good. It probably
Thank
couldn't
you.
get any better. And it's like, oh man, now it's getting better. Like, wow, this is wild. But it's definitely it's not just focused on Bigfoot itself. It makes the reader take a step back. And well, maybe I'm just speaking from how it affected me, but it's like it made me take a step back and be like, "Oh, okay, so what is my motivation myself in pursuing this actual subject? Like, how do I fit into this? Is it a, and it really be be warned, it makes you really kind of get deep a little bit at certain parts, which is good. I think that's good that the reader um, take a few minutes to think about, what is what is my part in this this Bigfoot subject, and why am I so intensely motivated in figuring out trying to figure out what's going on here, do I have the right motivation? It's just man, it's a very cool. So hats off to you for
I
that.
appreciate that a lot, that resonated with you, because of course, like most people are they want to talk about bits of evidence or statistical analyses of
Mm.
reports, and et cetera, et cetera. But those are the points that like really mattered the most to me, is because they're all kind of self examinations too. And as you know, the Sasquatch community, if that's really a thing, there's a million little sub communities
Oh,
that
there are.
people try to
Yeah.
house under the Bigfoot community, but it's not quite communal. Um,
No.
but I think people very often, they want to see themselves reflected. And
Mm.
so, I've met plenty of people who, because I try to wear a lot of hats, and a lot of that's just by accident. It just so happened that, I grew up playing music and had a lot of experience recording and engineering and things like that, and did the Bigfoot thing. And so when Cliff and Bobo were like, "Hey, we should do a podcast. Could you produce it and edit it and engineer it, do the musical bumpers?" Like, "Oh yeah, sure." Like it wasn't like I set out to be like, "Oh, I want to make a podcast." It was just, "Oh,
Mm.
I'm a Bigfoot researcher or Sasquatch, contender who has the know-how and, obviously friendship with those guys." But I can't tell you how many people I've met that are like, "Oh, those podcasters." And it's like, well,
Goodness, don't get me started, Matt.
well, they want to differentiate between those things. Or, I'll meet people that'll say, "Oh, what you should do is, invest in these long-term audio recorders that record for months at a time and then get this analyzing software and go through it." And it's like, that's not me. That's not what I'm interested in. I like being in the field, and I like carrying a camera and trying to get photographs and, exploring and looking for things, or being sort of posted up and trying to conduct myself like a wildlife photographer. I wouldn't go around telling people like, what you need to do is, put on snake boots and camo and a ghillie suit and get this DSLR camera and post up for 8 hours. Don't move, don't cough, don't breathe, don't all this kind of stuff. And so, but people want to impose their values on other people. And so it's like, or you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, well, stories are just stories. They're not worth anything." It's like, well, to some people, they're worth everything. And so there's a niche for everyone. And, I'm a huge fan of podcasts. I consume a lot of them across a number of different subjects, not just the Sasquatch thing, but a whole host of different subjects. Um, I love stories about, unrelated subjects. I mean, we're all storytelling, story listening creatures, and so stories are integral to the human experience. And so, if someone wants to hear Sasquatch stories, let them hear them. And if someone wants to be a collector or aggregator, or sort of like the discerning ear that says like, "Okay, well, I'll be the proxy for the audience. I think the audience should hear this story. Let me interview this person." There's a role for everyone, and they're all useful and needed. And so it does frustrate me to see people imposing, "Oh, you should be flying drones, or you should be putting up audio equipment, or you should be doing this," or whatever the case may be. It's like, let people do what they enjoy doing, leave them the hell alone. And if you like what they do, support them. It's that simple,
It
So
guys, it
I'm
really is that that's incredible, like, yeah. So, mm, I get that. I get it, man.
well, it's a tough thing because, and I see it in myself too, because I don't go around, I don't like comment on things that I love. You know, I listen to like my favorite music, or I watch amazing live performances on YouTube, and or like I listen to podcasts, you know what I mean? And absolutely love it. And then move on to the next thing. And so I think people don't post positive comments very often. It just, it doesn't always cross people's minds. But of course, you know, if someone has a gripe or something negative to say, they have no qualms about, like, this, I don't like this, I don't like that. And so I think it's easy for people in the online space who are podcasters, or, you know, if they have YouTube channels, whatever the case may be, to disproportionately see like people's negative takes and not realize, like, well, hey man, you got 30,000 downloads in that episode. Like 3 people said something negative. So maybe you do the math and think, well, probably more people liked it than not. They're just living busy lives and they're not going to stop there. Hey, love the episode. Keep up the great work. And some people do take the time to do that. But I reflect on my own experience, and I'm like, man, I don't go around leaving positive. I don't leave negative comments either, because I just don't think they're helpful. But I should be better about going like, great performance or great show,
Absolutely,
or,
yeah.
you know, whatever the case may be. But yeah, you can't let that stuff get through to you. And there's a niche for everyone in any given subject. And if people are genuine, like sincerely interested, have that genuine curiosity where they want to get to answers, and they want to learn more, like you can always tell authenticity, you know, and that should be rewarded and paid attention to. So
Here. So good. Was there a part of the book that you were like, "Oh, man, this has been in my head for so long, and now I can actually put it out there and other people can know." Was there anything like that that was like, "This is it's very, it only lives in this book"?
oh, there were a few of those things. I think trying to show the parallels between uh certain beliefs, let's say like pre-Western discovery beliefs associated with, you know, tigers, with bears, with gorillas, that are analogous to beliefs that are associated with the Sasquatch, not only in indigenous cultures, but also in modern day, because the Sasquatch is still in that, you know, pre-discovery or undiscovered sort of phase, and showing that, you know, I do think that a lot of those are sort of the normative ways of perceiving the world, the natural world, as well as the sort of inner world, these sort of phenomenological descriptions. That was a sort of discovery, I would say, or maybe a revelation would be more like it, because, you know, people had written about this and all these other animals, and I just hadn't encountered it and associated it with the Sasquatch yet. So it's not like I made a discovery. It was just like revealed that all this other great work existed, but that no one had really looked into it, to the Sasquatch, that way. So trying to make that point of, well, it's wrong to dismiss it because it's associated with supernatural beliefs, because other very real animals are too, and we wouldn't dismiss their existence just because they are purported to, you know, mediate between realms, or paralyze people, you know, with their gaze or with their mind, or to know the contents of a person's heart as sort of like a moral judge or something like that. But likewise, to try to defend that against some of those supernatural essentialists, or supernatural maximalists, I guess you could say,
Right.
that say like, well,
Yeah.
no, we don't think tigers and bears and gorillas can do that, but Sasquatch, they definitely can. They actually really can do all these things because they really do have these powers. You know what I mean? So
Right.
that I thought was not really as well explored in other books, or illuminated that I'm aware of. I think the discussion about the physiological and psychological responses, you know, as a sort of like bottom up physiological response, you know, innate freezing, tonic immobility, and then this sort of cognitive shock
Yeah.
from disruption of categorization,
Oh, yeah.
the encounter with the novel or the unknown, all those occurring simultaneously, and then reading the literature to see like what that basically does to people and how it incapacitates them. And then you think about an animal that can do all that to a person, and it's not the animal doing it, it's just the normative innate human response to these categories of stimuli, let's say. And then to, you know, I wanted to illuminate that so fully, so that if people read that and understood it, they wouldn't think to themselves when they hear an encounter story, oh, why didn't you get a picture? You know, it's like, because they were
I get that all the time.
incapacitated. And
Yeah.
by the time their systems come back online, because I describe it as like a series, like a cascade of system failures, is the sort of analogy I use there. And by the time the systems come back online, the thing's gone, because most encounters are very, very brief. And so that I had a lot of fun exploring and writing. The problem is always like what not to say, because any one of those sections I kept adding and adding. I was like, oh, this is going to turn into a chapter. And any one of those chapters could have turned into like 3 chapters if I wasn't careful. So trying to keep it like under 100,000 words, 300 pages,
Wow.
I knew was going to be the kind of goal, and make it tighter and tighter and more concise. And I wanted it to be unpackable too, where, you could take a section and really spend a lot of time extracting things out of it and not just elaborate something to death.
That that witness section of the book was actually it was my favorite of the book. I had actually a note about it, um, just because, as you said, I'd never seen that approached in another book. But I the part when you're talking about, I believe you're talking to a witness, and she had to explain to you about, what it's like when you're driving and there's a car coming towards you, and you almost have a head-on collision. It's like that, and that just like really got me. Because I'm usually talking to a lot of witnesses in interviews, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's such a good reminder that it's just like, as you said, like just systems failures shuts down.
Well, I was so young at that time. That was one of the first witnesses that I'd interviewed. She was a local witness. That sighting happened like maybe half a mile from the house I grew up in. It's real close. I mean, I could walk out my mom's back door and be at that spot in just, a couple minutes. And so when I had found her, and it's one of the best sightings too, because, a lot of people see them in the forest. And so there's some sort of obstructions, or it's not always the most favorable conditions, or, there's canopies thick and not a lot of light is getting through. But what she saw, this woman was essentially driving, we got her to be featured in that first episode of Finding Bigfoot. So she's
Sure.
featured in that episode. She was driving north between Cleveland and Helen, like you're heading towards Helen, Georgia. And there's a stretch where it kind of goes downhill, and this creek called Duke's Creek passes under 75. And this thing came up over the embankment and was crossing the road, and she slammed on the brakes and it just stopped. And so it's right in front of her vehicle, fully illuminated by her headlights, no obstructions. I mean, she can see it head to toe, and she was terrified. And, short stare off, and then it just kept going the way it was going. And so when I first met her at that spot, what was interesting, it was years after it had happened. It was in the early 2000s. She saw it. The encounter that I had is like a mile from there, as the crow flies, maybe 2 miles. I'd have to pull up Google Maps. It's very close. It's in the same valley, the same river valley. And my encounter was in summer of 99, and her sighting was on Thanksgiving Day of 1999. So it could have been the same animal that we encountered.
Yeah.
Who knows? And so by the time I interviewed her at the site, a few years had passed. And, my brain's like exploding with Sasquatch information from these books that I'm reading. And, and I'm trying to, it's like the Beautiful Mind, where all these other reports
Right.
are coming up, and there's text flashing across my face. And so she was explaining to me what she saw. And there was kind of a quiet moment. And I was so excited. They just amped up, really. And I was just talking out loud, like maybe it was following this creek, and there's these meadows over here, and there's probably a lot of deer, and maybe it's fun, just talking
Yeah.
away. And she just stopped me.
Exactly.
She's like, "Have you seen one?" And I was like, "Well, no." And she goes, "Then you don't know." And she pointed her finger at me like, "Then you don't know. I thought I was gonna die." And I had to go like and realize like, oh, this thing that I think is so exciting or cool, she wanted to be understood, and I wasn't understanding her. I was trying to like reverse engineer the mind of this animal, and she just wanted someone to go, "Hey, please believe me," because she faced ridicule and disbelief from people, and I saw that firsthand too from people in the community, and which was terribly unfortunate. But she wanted me to understand that, like, no, I was stricken with fear. And that's when she goes, "Have you ever been driving and someone swerves into your lane and you're just sure you're going to have a head-on collision?" She said, "That's what it felt like." She said it didn't do anything. It didn't exhibit any behaviors that made me feel it. She said it was just right there. It was so big. I was thinking, what is that? What is that? Just terrifying, you know?
Wow.
And so that's always stuck with me. And, you know, you'll hear that in witnesses. That's why, you know, in a lot of those historical reports that I include in the historical record, you see the same descriptions of the human response, you know, benumbed, couldn't speak, immediately struck with palsy, one of them says, or like paralyzed in place, on and on and on. I mean, it's very frightening for people.
It's such a good part. It
I
really is.
appreciate it. I'm glad you
Uh,
enjoyed that.
I, d- I learned a few things from the book, but one that sticks out in my mind, and hope I'm pronouncing the word right. Um, when you're talking about like the description of the creature itself, you talked to, I believe the word is cathameral.
Ephemeral.
Cathameral. Okay. Can you kind of? I think it might be interesting that if you could kind of explain what that kind of means. It's the first time that I'd ever seen that really talked about. I thought it was fascinating.
Well, it was coined fairly recently. It's not a very old term. I'm pretty sure it was Ian Tattersall. In fact, I think I referenced Tattersall. I'm pretty sure Ian Tattersall coined the term. If I'm wrong, I'll have to check back and see. But I was first introduced to that term from a BFRO investigator named Dennis Fole, because I didn't know there was a technical term for that sort of activity cycle within a 24-hour window. And so Dennis Fole had described to me once, like, oh, well, if you know, he said that things that they were finding in other areas, you know, because I was living in the Northwest at the time when I first spoke to him, and he said, oh yeah, well, we're finding, just like John Green's database shows, like they're active at day and night, which, you know, you're getting that from a whole lot of reports from all over the continent. He said, but even here in this little area where we're focusing, these individuals seem to be just active at periods like throughout the day and the night. You know, it's like activity punctuated by inactivity, followed by activity. And, you know, I think people are starting to realize that many animals function that way. Animals that we thought were primarily diurnal or primarily nocturnal or crepuscular. Oh, they only move at dawn and dusk. I mean, I think game cameras changed that a lot, because you have game cameras and it's like, oh, there's bears, you know, at the brightest, hottest part of the day up moving around. Oh, there's bears at 3 a.m. moving around. Oh, there's
That's true.
bears,
Yeah.
you know, right before dark. Oh, there's bears after first light. I mean, they're just moving around in these periods of what seem to be pretty ephemeral, you know, lifestyles. So I don't know who necessarily, like which disciplines, whether it's, you know, ethology or biology, or who would actually determine whether an animal falls strictly within that category, if that's just sort of a broad category. But it does seem to apply to Sasquatches. But again, other animals seem to fit that bill too. I mean, I've seen that with wild hogs on game cameras. And obviously, you know, we all know that cats, you know, many mammalian predators hunt at night, but I've gotten an equal number of bobcats during the day that I've gotten at night on game cameras. So I think it's a term that applies to more of the animal world than we might have realized before we had sort of surveillance systems in the woods, seeing
Right.
what
Yeah.
these things are
Yeah.
really up to, you know.
It's I was like, man, that's cool. Um, was there a section of the book that you were very apprehensive to write about, and you're like, I don't know if I should put this in. I don't know how it's going to be received, or maybe that wasn't the case at all, and you're like, hey, let's go for all of this. No
Yeah,
sweat.
there were a few. I mean, it's really hard to do Carl Jung's ideas about what,
Sure.
you know, the collective unconscious and archetype. It's hard to do that in short sections. And so, you know, I parsed it down as much as I could, but it's very difficult to fully, I mean, you know, like this collection, the archetypes and the collective unconscious is
Ooh.
it's pretty, and that's not all he wrote about those concepts. And so to try to make sense of it in the context of the references that I was using, of course, when it's first introduced is in the first chapter, when we're talking about various sort of or alternative options of the Sasquatch being like a product of the human mind or the human psyche. It's like, well, some people have proposed this, that it's something, that's innate within us, i.e. some element of the collective unconscious or some archetypal form or motif. And so trying to parse that down and do it justice was really hard, because there's so much there. And then it gets revisited more in depth in a later chapter that's sort of the elaborated Sasquatch. We're sort of elaborating out these biological or psychological models and then seeing how they merge together. So that was pretty arduous. And then obviously there's a chapter about, these sort of categories. I try to make the analogy that like, well, we have this territory, this conceptual territory that we're trying to map, and you always hear it said like, well, the map is not the territory. The map's like a representation of the territory, and there can be errors on the map. And so I stuck with that analogy to say, well, let's look at people that are trying to map this space, the cartographers. And there's a lot of people with great intentions who make errors. We all do. No one's immune to error. Like none of us, you can't do some inventory of everything we've ever done or said and find no errors. Of course, we make mistakes or faux pas or well-intentioned errors, but then of course you do have hoaxers and people that introduce intentional, false landmarks onto these maps. And then you have people that dismiss them for all the wrong reasons. And so they sort of erase these landmarks, so to speak. And then there's people that try to, here's a big blank space. No one seems to have staked that flag here yet. And then they'll, exploit those places. And so that was a little tricky to write, because I didn't want it to be cynical. I mean, some things have to be necessarily, maybe critical would be the word, but I'm not necessarily trying to criticize as much as I am trying to illuminate. But then I felt like the next chapter, which is the final chapter, is very optimistic. And it's very much, the path forward, reasons to be optimistic, the meaning that can be found in any pursuit. This one, is no different. Pursuing the Sasquatch can be just as meaningful as pursuing, other endeavors. And so that one was a little hard to write because it felt like it could get cynical at times if I wasn't being careful. So I tried really hard to not be cynical, but then the next one being optimistic, I think balanced it out. Hopefully you can tell me, because I can't, it's hard to be, I can't read it as a outsider,
The chapter that you're referring to with the map analogy, at the beginning, I was like, I don't know if he's going to get through this minefield without exploding. And it, like, you made it through, is really like, I was like, wow, that was intense, but very well done. And yeah, it's one of the best parts of the book, in my opinion. I mean, because there's a lot of truth in there that makes you think, and especially if you know a lot about the community, it really makes you think, what's the motivation behind what the people that why they're trying to find Sasquatch, what's their motivation, and it really
or if
leads
they're
you
trying
into,
to find Sasquatch,
yeah,
or if they're
there you
just
go.
trying to
There you go.
appear as if
Oh yeah,
they're trying to find Sasquatch.
yeah,
And it can be a frustrating thing. And it is funny because the other funny thing is, like, I was like, well, should I worry about some people being, offended by that? Because it's not really an accusation.
no,
It's just an observation that, well, there are some people who are who have the appearance of being heavily involved, but in fact, like, all their energy goes into creating the appearance of being heavily involved. And then I realized, like, oh, they won't be offended because they don't read books, so I don't have to worry about it. You know what I mean? Like, seriously,
no,
because
that's
those
true.
people, they're
And
not trying to contend with whether or not the Sasquatch exists, and if it exists, what it could be. They're not wrestling with those questions. They're worried about other things. And so I was like, oh, well,
exactly,
they'll never read this, So
yeah,
and I'm
it's
not,
a solid point.
naming people by
No,
name or anything. I mean, this was just categories of people that have been around since the beginning. If there was anything I didn't put in there, there was one section where I talk about sort of two of the original luminaries, I would say, and how divergent their paths were in terms of the way that they conducted themselves, the way they presented themselves, and their sort of impact on the subject. And then I thought, no, I won't leave that in there, just because it wasn't necessarily the kindest about one of those people. So I'll just leave it at that, you know.
I totally get it. That section made me kind of think pretty deep about some stuff too. Do you think that as a research community, we are maybe um, well, I want to be careful how I say it because I don't want to trigger algorithms. Um, uh, Kind of making it so we'll never reach the goal by uh, cloaking all of our research areas so that we are the only ones that know where they are, and there's no um, central um, area of knowledge because no one's sharing because they want to know, they want to have all the glory for themselves. Do you think the
I think
phrase
there's
is
pros and cons.
yeah.
There's costs and benefits to everything. And then obviously, like if you're completely forthcoming about your specific research areas, let's say like where you're spending the most time hoping to either encounter physical evidence or sign or a living Sasquatch itself. If you're forthright about that, you wouldn't be surprised if someone eventually played a prank on you or hoaxed you, right?
Hmm.
And so, of course, there's a benefit to not disclosing that information, but there might be some cost. But I mean, for the most part, it's like, well, you know, I'm doing stuff in North Georgia, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina. Like, it's not going to do me any good to tell people in the Pacific Northwest where I am because it's not like they can get out here and help me anyway. They'd be looking at the same Google Maps data that I am trying to make,
True.
you know, decisions. And so there probably are some costs to not being able to share certain things and not being able to communicate things. But I think the biggest part of that is like, yeah, people are right to protect themselves from, you know, because you're trying to control as many variables as possible, which is like, well, hey, I'm reasonably certain that if I heard this category of sound in this place or found this sort of impression in this place, I'm fairly certain that it wasn't made for my, you know, detection. Versus like if I talked all the time about exactly where I was going,
Yeah.
then anything I'd heard, I'd be like, well, is that someone who's like, hey, that we got to get that Pruitt guy, you know, and go knock trees or whatever, you know? So I can understand that sort of that protective part of it. But you know, I would say maybe the other big part of that is that I wish that now for me, I can't speak to what I don't want to be the guy I just complained about in the beginning of this show by saying like what you need to do is what
Right.
I have chosen to do for myself. And you know, again, it has pros and cons. To me, mostly pros is that you know if you were to familiarize yourself with like categories of evidence and then sort of identify what is seems to be like the best in its class of each category, you know, in terms of tracks. Well, some of them are extraordinarily detailed, you know, like the Grays Harbor County tracks. Like there's
Oh, sure.
one
Yeah.
right there up here. You see all five toes. You see the sort of like, you know, the bony prominences in certain places, etc. Now, those have never constituted proof. They're still sort of contested or debated to this day. So for me, it's like, well, if I find a track or a track way or something like that of lesser quality, lesser detail, let's say, you know, where, you know, they're just soggy impressions in the duff, you know, I would, of course, document it and as much as I could. But would I release it? Would I publish it? It's like, well, why? Because if something that's much higher in quality, higher resolution doesn't constitute, you know, compelling evidence to many people, then why should I expect that something of much lesser quality would be compelling? So I would spend more time defending something rather than like, okay, well, I've seen these tracks. I should keep coming back here. Now I have a reason to invest more time and energy in this particular spot because I found these impressions, and maybe I'll get better tracks, you know, an excellent line of tracks. And I do the same thing with audio recordings. I mean, I do use audio recorders in the field. I just record a night at a time. I don't record for weeks or months or something like that. But, and I've heard vocalizations and sometimes I've recorded them, but you have something as clear as the Ohio Howl,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and there's other examples of that recording, that sort of vocalization, rather, big bellowing moaning howls, but not many of them are as close and clear as that. So it's like, okay, well, if I got one that was noisier and seemed to be further away and fainter, where it's like, oh, hey, well, I ran it through 30 filters, but listen to it with headphones on and make sure the volume's all the way. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to defend something that's not equal to or better than the best in its class. And so the con of that is, like, the cost versus benefit. Well, the cost of that is that I've had to go around saying, like, I've been trying to get better evidence for 20 years, and here's my collection of 0 things. But I can live with that, because I would prefer to say, okay, well, if I want to put something forth, I know it's defensible because the quality is so high. And I think people do themselves, they set themselves up for a lot of headache and heartache by constantly feeling the need in that community to either appease people who are paying attention, or very often to compete with other researchers and say, like, oh, I've got this entire catalog of evidence. And we've all seen those sorts of things. And it's like red circle after red circle and broken twig after broken twig and divot in the ground after divot in the ground. And some of those may be Sasquatch related, but like, when you look at those pictures, it's like, well, I'll never know. I'll never know if you didn't break that twig or not. And so let's save it. So for me, like, that's part of why I don't necessarily, like, quote unquote, share with the communities. Like, I don't have anything I feel is worth sharing yet, but I'll keep trying for it. And if I never get it, that's fine, because I'm having a blast along the way. But so I think a lot of what is being shared within the community is what also drives all the animosity, is that, because there is a section in that chapter about the value of claims and evidence.
Yeah.
And like, what has value to one person because they were there, so they have a personal connection to it, oftentimes has no value to anyone who wasn't there. Because again, they look at it and they go, well, how do I know you didn't break that twig? Or like, listen to these knocks I recorded. It's like, well, how do I know that's not you in your backyard hitting a tree? Versus when you hear a big, powerful vocalization like the Ohio Owl, no one thinks that that's like a dude standing out there. It's like, what is that? That's pretty strange. It sounds like an animal. It doesn't sound synthesized or mechanical. What kind of animal is that? So that's really remarkable. So I think sometimes sharing is the driver of all that animosity. You know what I mean?
That is so interesting. Is there, let's say you have a person reading your book. Is there something that you're hoping that they take away or changes them in a certain way after they're done reading your book?
I hope that it makes, if someone's already pretty invested in the Sasquatch subject, and again, like a devoted student, I hope it expands and they think, oh, wow, there's more here than I was aware of. And there's things I didn't know about. And I do hope it makes people a bit more charitable and generous. Because I do try to say, like, again, those ways to sort of look at each other more generously, more charitably, not so negatively. I mean, the only negative things I call out are like the obvious exploiters and hoaxers and charlatans and people that are genuinely bad actors. And then for the lay person, if someone's brand new to the subject, I just want them to come away and go, like, I had no idea there was so much to this, that it's not just, a few campfire stories and a couple of plaster casts and that one grainy film. That's what the rest of the world thinks it is. And so I hope they come away and go, wow, there's a lot here. This is really a question worth answering, hopefully.
Man, Matt, it has been a fun time having you on. I would really recommend people go and get a copy of your book and check it out for themselves. So recommend it. Are there other ways that people can keep up to date with what you are doing?
Oh, yeah. You can go to, if you want to reach out, it's at mattpruittonline.com, and there's a contact form there. And then about the only social media I use for Bigfoot related stuff is Twitter. I think it's at @MPruittBigfoot. I tweet very infrequently. And so most of the time that I'm on social media, it's for Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo. So you can always reach out through that podcast too. And then I do co-host the bonus show that we do called Beyond Bigfoot and Beyond. So you can hear me on there as well.
How do you hear the bonus show, Matt?
It's on Patreon. So if you go to
Oh,
like
wow.
bigfootandbeyondpodcast.com and click membership, or in the show notes of any of the Bigfoot and Beyond episodes, there's a link to it's $5 a month, and we drop an episode every Thursday. So that's been going on
It's
for
awesome.
next month will be a year. So we'll be celebrating a year of the bonus show, and it's pretty fun. It's less filtered, I would say.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Bobo's less filtered. Let's say it that way.
There you go. Oh man, thank you so much for coming on, Matt. This has been a good time.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Jeremiah. Thank you.